This is a review of the slides for Chapter 4, Heckscher-Ohlin model. This model is similar to the classical model in the sense that comparative advantage is what's going to drive the decision about trading and who's going to produce and export one good versus the other. The difference between the Heckscher-Ohlin and the classical is that Heckscher-Ohlin is trying to give you an explanation for why the country has a lower opportunity cost and therefore has the comparative advantage. In the classical, it simply said the countries were different, they had this lower opportunity cost, and this trade was the result. You should read through these assumptions and, of course, the chapter to get a better idea. But basically what it's trying to get to is the idea that different products use different inputs at different levels of intensity. In particular, in terms of capital-labor ratios, labor per machine, machine per labor. And that each country also has a different supply, a different factor endowment of these resources. And again, not just capital versus labor, but the combination. One of the reasons you want to have these ratios instead of just flat out capital and flat out labor is that you want to be able to compare someplace like China with 1.7 billion people and somewhere like the United States with 340 million people. Obviously, the Chinese are going to have more labor. The question is, labor per machine is what really is going to matter in terms of making this argument for the theory of comparative advantage and therefore trade. So you should read through this, get kind of the sense of that, but the bottom line is that what you're going to come up with is the theorem. And basically it's going to be that the country which is rich, relatively abundant in a capital or labor, will have a comparative advantage in the production of a good that uses that abundant resource intensely. So a country that has a lot of capital relative to machinery, relative to labor, will be good at producing airplanes because airplanes are capital intensive. You need a lot of equipment, and it's a combination of how much you have, period, versus or in conjunction with how much you have, which then affects the cost of each of those inputs. So if you have a lot of labor per unit of machine, a consequence of that will be that labor will be relatively inexpensive compared to capital, or relatively less expensive in your country compared to other countries. It's that sense of what we're trying to get at from the theorem. Once you've read through the textbook, you should have a good understanding of how that is intended to work. What I would like to kind of point out or work with you on is the graphs, because now we're going to have increasing cost production possibility frontiers. So our curved lines here are our production possibility frontiers for the two countries. Our CIC curves are going to be different for each country because the consumers in those countries have different preferences. Each country is going to have an autarky equilibrium, which is going to be, I'll go back to the slide, I'm sorry, which is going to be on the production possibility frontier and on the highest CIC they can get to when they are not trading, so autarky, and the slopes of those two curves at that point will represent the opportunity cost and the relative price. And of course I mean the absolute value of the slope, since it's going to be downward sloping straight lines that we're going to use to measure slope. They're going to have negative slopes. We want to talk about quantities of yards of cloth in terms of 1 yard of soybeans. Therefore, we take the absolute value. So in these graphs, we have country A's production possibility frontier. We have which represents their supply. We have the consumer indifference curve, which represents their demand. Equilibrium is going to be the point of tangency of those two. And from that point of tangency, we get a straight line whose slope will tell us about opportunity cost and relative price in the two countries. If we had full information, numerical values, we would be able to do easily a comparison. However, you should recognize that if the slope is the absolute value, the steeper the line is, the more y you have to give up to produce one more x. Therefore, since the relative price or opportunity cost line is steep for B, we can steeper for B than it is for A, we can conclude that A is going to have the comparative advantage in the production of soybeans. And once we know that, again, you could do it mathematically, but with comparative advantage, it means you know the other side, which is that country B must have comparative advantage in the other product, which in this case is going to be textiles. So this is the combination they can produce and consume without trade. This is the combination country B produces and consumes without trade. Hickshaw-Ohlin explains why the slopes are different, why the relative price and the opportunity cost are different. And therefore, just knowing that the theory says that the country A is producing the good which uses its relatively abundant resource intensely puts those two ideas together. You need more information to be able to make that statement in terms of what good it is or to conclude it, but graphically, that's the information that we're getting from this picture. Moving ahead to this picture, we get to a point where we want to have trade. And again, maybe the slides don't have enough information, but the textbook has a description of it. If you view these two graphs, again, country A and country B, they are the situation with trade. So basically, the picture we had for autarky equilibrium is gone, but it did give us the information that country A had a comparative lower opportunity cost in the production of soybeans, the good on the horizontal axes, therefore the comparative advantage in the good on the horizontal axes. Therefore, it was going to increase its production, specialize in the production of soybeans when the two countries decided to trade. And the other country, B, had the comparative advantage in textiles, and therefore that country is going to specialize in the production of textiles when the two countries trade. You'll notice that production is not going to be at an endpoint here. Production is going to be somewhere else on the production possibility frontier, increasing the production of the good that each country has the comparative advantage in, but not completely specializing. The terms of trade, or the lines listed here as PS over PT, are determined by market forces. Once you have that, it's going to tell us where on the production possibility frontier the countries are going to produce, and then where on their possibility are they going to consume. So first, we look for where the TOT, or this case PS over PT lines, are tangent to each of the production possibility frontiers. For country A, it's here at XA. For country B, it's here at XB. Those are tangency points for the total TOT line or PST world relative price line, and the production possibility frontiers with trade. That's where each country is going to produce in that situation. The line also, as I said in my description in chapter 3, is the trade possibility line. If they produce at XA or they produce at XB, the line, terms of trade, international trade relative price line, can tell you what combinations they could consume in this world with trade, and they're specializing in the production of the good they've produced. Basically exporting that good and importing the other good, giving them this set of combinations they could consume. The point on that line, which is going to be where they do consume, is going to be CA for country A and CB for country B. It's a point of tangency between that line and the country's consumer and community indifference curves, therefore representing the quantities that this country is going to demand. This is the combination this country is going to demand. They get to their point of consumption in country A by exporting soybeans and importing textiles. And that's represented in this graph as the space, the range, the line segment from XA to VA, and they import the amount of textiles represented by the line segment VA to CA or CA to VA, depending on how you read it. And the same is true for the other country. So it's a similar mechanism. Who has lower opportunity cost? The one who has the lower opportunity cost has the comparative advantage. Hickshaw-Ohlin tells you why they have the lower opportunity cost. Then the mechanism is, where do they produce? Where the relative price line is tangent to the PPF. And where do they consume? Somewhere else above the production possibility frontier, showing that they're able to gain from trade and consume a combination that just wasn't possible if they didn't have international trade. And that is the real crux of what this chapter is trying to do and present to you graphically.